Can people now leave quietly for those who are leaving? We will try again. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was absolutely nothing in that address from the Prime Minister for the people of Scotland, and I hope for people that were watching and listening back home that it was led by the announcement "This is not for viewers and listeners in Scotland." Mr. Speaker, let me congratulate the member for Chatham and Aylesford and for Walsall North for their addresses this afternoon. And when I was listening to all the stories about Christmas Carol, of course we didn't hear from what member of the Conservative front bench would be playing Scrooge. And I must say to the honourable member for Walsall North, I know he's a great football fan. I thought he would perhaps mention Aston Villa. I know they're not having the best of times, but I hope he's enjoying watching John McGinn that we gifted from Hibernian to him last year. Mr. Speaker, this morning Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has written to the Prime Minister to demand the transfer of legal powers to the Scottish Government to hold a second independence referendum under Section 30 of the Scotland Act. Mr. Speaker, as the First Minister outlined, there has been a material change of circumstances since the independence referendum of 2014, based on the prospect of Scotland leaving the European Union against its will. And it is for the Prime Minister to explain to the people of Scotland why he is denying Scotland the right to choose our own future. Why did democracy stop in the Prime Minister's world with the independence referendum in 2014? And can I say to the Prime Minister, it is not a good look to see him playing with his phone rather than listening to the legitimate demands of the Scottish National Party. Of course, the Prime Minister says something more interesting. Well, Prime Minister, this is about democracy. This is about the Scottish National Party that stood in the election on a manifesto about Scotland's right to choose. And it was about the Conservatives that said no to Indyref2. And, Mr. Speaker, what happened? Well, the Conservatives lost more than half their members of Parliament. Prime Minister, you got your answer from the people of Scotland. The SNP got 45% of the vote, a 20% difference to the government. We got 80% of the members of Parliament that sit on these benches. Someday, the Prime Minister is going to have to respect democracy. The Prime Minister can't and will not continue to say no.
To my right honourable friend for giving way. The Prime Minister says that looking at his phone is more interesting than hearing what Scotland needs. Doesn't that tell you everything? Doesn't that tell you everything about this Prime Minister and his view of Scotland?
Indeed it does. Mr. Speaker, well, there isn't really much that can be added to that, because the image of the Prime Minister playing with his phone, not listening to the Scottish National Party, says it all. Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland did not vote for this Prime Minister. Scotland did not vote for this Conservative government, and we certainly did not vote for this con of a Tory plan set out today. Mr. Speaker, in December 1967, my old friend Winnie Ewing proclaimed that the march of time can bring anomalies between elections, so that sometimes a government may have a majority in this House but be in a minority in the country. Mr. Speaker, in Scotland that is certainly the case. Here in this place we face a Tory government that we have rejected, implementing a manifesto that Scotland rejected. Mr. Speaker, for too many years Scotland has been held back by successive Tory governments that we didn't vote for. Mr. Speaker, SNP MPs have today set out an alternative Queen's speech to deliver for the people of Scotland with a renewed and strengthened mandate. our expanded SNP team will focus on our priorities, on Scotland's priorities, on stopping Brexit and protecting Scotland's NHS from any grubby Trump trade deal, on dealing with the climate emergency and once and for all putting to an end Tory austerity. The government's Queen's speech instead sets out another Tory government that the people of Scotland rejected. Despite the fact that Scotland voted to remain a member of the EU, we now face being dragged out against our will. We often hear about losers' consent, but the fact of the matter here is that Scotland voted to stay in the European Union to maintain our rights as EU citizens. This Conservative government does not have the consent of the people of Scotland, does not have the consent of the Scottish Parliament or our government to take Scotland out of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, we ask that the solemn right claimed by the people of Scotland to determine the form of government best suited to our needs must be exercised. This claim of right was accepted as a principle in this House on a motion moved by myself in July 2018. Mr. Speaker, it is the Scottish people who are sovereign. In this context, it is right for the House to respect our Scottish Parliament and to respect the election result from last week. But of course, in the last Parliament, the Tories ignored our interests and sidelined the will of the Scottish Government, intent on bringing forward a deal that will destroy our economy, risk jobs and livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, as the former EU Permanent Representative to the EU, Sir Ivan Rogers, said, this pledge will create the biggest crisis of Brexit to date in late 2020. Get Brexit done is diplomatic amateurism dressed up domestically as boldness and decisiveness. From setting off our NHS to sending out Scotland's fishing communities. The Prime Minister will inflict hardship on our communities at the cost of delivering his damaging Brexit. And with the people of Scotland silenced, their voices silenced, the 80% of the seats in this House not listened to by a Tory government showing contempt. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we stand up for Scotland. That we stand up against these cruel, punishing policies and narrow, backward-gazing politics. And instead, Mr. Speaker, that we are determined that Scotland's right to choose our own future will be delivered. Not simply because we in the SNP want it, but because the people of Scotland are demanding it. We stood on a mandate to give Scotland the right to choose its own future. And I want to put the Prime Minister on notice. The SNP members on these benches will not ever stop fighting this government for that case, for our mandate to be respected, a mandate for a fresh independence referendum. Now, I see the honourable gentleman seeking to intervene. Will he accept democracy? Will he accept the right of Scotland to choose?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Will he accept democracy? Will he accept that last week 55% of Scots voted for parties that want to remain in the United Kingdom? There is no mandate for a second independence referendum in Scotland. The Scottish people are not calling out for a second independence referendum. They want us to get on with the day job. Fix your own backyard first before you come in here demanding that the Scottish...
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend says, what absolute tosh. You know, you cannot get away from the fact that we won the election. We sit here standing up as a voice for Scotland, and he lost most of his colleagues that were rejected at the ballot box. They've been reduced to a rump. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that we have got 80% of the seats on our side. The government could only wish that it had such a mandate, such a majority in the rest of the queue. The reality is, no Democrat can deny this. We won the election. We demand the right to have our referendum. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament has a strong record for bettering the lives of citizens across Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, we know with more powers, with independence, we can and we will do so much more. Today, the SNP has published our alternative Queen's speech. The people of Scotland voted to lock Boris Johnson out of Downing Street and escape Brexit. Scotland voted to choose a better future. Our plan is to deliver that better future. We want to see a National Health Service Protection Bill to stop the NHS across the UK being at risk from a US trade deal. This will guarantee that trade deals will not undermine the founding principle of the NHS that we cherish so much. We will continue to make the case and work to ensure that Scotland's voice is heard and our nation has the right to choose its future. We will deliver in Scotland a bill to increase parental leave with an additional 12 weeks to be ring-fenced for the father in order to encourage take-up as well as to increase statutory maternity and paternity pay. The SNP New Green Deal will build on the transition towards a greener, sustainable future. And we will continue to press the UK Government to match Scotland's net zero emissions target by 2045 and putting oil and gas receipts into a net zero fund focused on measures to battle climate change, putting tackling the climate emergency front and centre of our priorities. That, Mr. Speaker, is what a responsible government does. And of course, unlike the Conservatives, our ambition is to end poverty, not increase it by a failure to act, a failure to show leadership. Poverty is not inevitable, and to fight it, we will work to end the disgraceful two-child cap on tax credits and associated rate clause. We call on the United Kingdom Government immediately to end the benefits freeze and to halt the rollout of universal credit. And, Mr. Speaker, we will use every device open to us in this place to make the case that we cannot allow our citizens to be dragged into debt, hardship and despair by this nasty, careless Tory government. We want to bring forward an equal living wage bill, meaning that living wage increases to at least the level of the real living wage and an end to age discrimination. Scottish National Party MPs reject the wholly immoral replacement of nuclear weapons at a cost of over $200 billion. And we call on other parties to follow us, to say no to Trident, to remove these weapons of mass destruction from the Clyde. And, Mr. Speaker, we want to help our pensioners by ensuring the BBC licence fee remains free for those aged over 75. And just like we have done in previous parliaments, we will not abandon those women born in the 1950s by exposing and demanding that this government delivers justice for the 3.8 million women born in the 1950s, denied their pension by this Conservative UK government. We will be pressing for an NHS funding boost from the UK government that matches the current Scottish level, and for constitutional change and abolishing the House of Lords, extending the franchise to include 16 and 17-year-olds. Mr. Speaker, this expanded SNP group is determined, and we are ready for the challenge. This government thinks it can do what it wants to with Scotland and get away with it. It will not happen on our watch. The Tories are risking our economy and reducing opportunities for citizens. Mr. Speaker, the choice is clear. An outward-looking country with a vision of tolerance, inclusiveness and prosperity for all, in contrast to this offering of a union run by a Tory party who don't care about Scotland. The Tory programme for government that will push child poverty to a 60-year high and devastate our economy. The hardest of Tory Brexits that risks up to 100,000 jobs being lost in Scotland. The Tory manifesto means that in 2023-24, day-to-day spending on public services outside health would still be almost 15% lower in real terms than it was in the start of the 2010s. Austerity has hit the communities hard, and it's not going away. It is more of the same from the Tories. And despite the climate emergency, there is nothing in this Queen's speech to make real progress on reducing emissions. The UK Government has already failed to match the Scottish Government's net zero emission target of 2045. And, Mr Speaker, that's just the start of it. And yes, the Conservatives can say England and Wales had its say. But what about Scotland? We had our say, and Scotland rejected this Prime Minister. Scotland rejected the Tories. For those of us who represent the people and the will of Scotland, we will use every avenue open to protecting our people against this government and its shoddy plan for government. Mr Speaker, before I close, I want to appeal to members across the House. In the last Parliament, members conducted themselves in less than acceptable ways on occasions, and people across these islands have recognised it, and they are fed up with it. So let us start this Parliament with respect and let the strength of our arguments win the case rather than dragging this place into the gutter. Finally, Mr Speaker, in setting out the SNP's clear opposition to the Government's Queen's speech and offering our alternative, I have set out to the people of Scotland the tale of two governments, of two parties, of two futures. I started with the words of Winnie Ewing, and I want to begin closing with the words of another parliamentarian. Let me remind the House of the words of Charles Stewart Parnell. No man has the right to fix the boundary to a march of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, "Thus far shalt thou go and no further." Now Scotland must have the chance to choose its own future, one shackled to the Brexit destruction imposed by Westminster, or one with hope, with opportunity and ambition, an independent Scotland in the European Union.
Former Prime Minister Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and may I first of all take this opportunity of congratulating you on your election as Speaker. I know that you